Good evening. Welcome to GVF. This is our 2019 Faith in Science series that you're stepping into right now. If you don't know what you're coming into, we have, over the last few years, we've pursued conversations as a church that are broader than just the traditional church conversations, because we wanted to create an atmosphere where people can discuss things that really matter to them, the big questions, the big issues of life, and we've been able, through a series of grants, to bring in speakers and host conversations like this tonight. And tonight, we're partnering with Coventry Christian Schools to host this event. So I wanted to introduce Talia to you from Coventry Christian.
Hello, everyone. My name is Talia Matthew, and I'm a senior at Coventry Christian Schools. And it's a great honor to be with you guys tonight. So one key concept that Coventry as a school really likes to put in their curriculum is that we try to emphasize critical thinking by not boxing with grandma. If you're like, what's that? That's fine. Boxing with grandma is when you only challenge yourself with the weakest argument that an opponent has. Because when you do that and you train yourself that way, then you're really not building up your critical thinking at all. So when I was preparing for this, I was talking in particular with two of our science teachers at our school, our middle school science teacher and our high school science teacher. When I was talking with our middle school science teacher, something that really blew my mind when he was talking to me was saying that whenever he's giving a lesson or just teaching a class, he tries to introduce Jesus into every way that he possibly can. And if he hasn't done that in the lesson, then he feels like he has failed the students. And that was just really powerful to me, because that way the students have this intricate Christian science faith background, and they are rooted in their science and faith curriculum that way. And now when I was talking to my high school teacher, he was explaining how not only does he teach creationism, but he also teaches evolution and theistic evolution, all micro and macro, and he tries to do it at a pretty objective lens as well. And this was interesting to me also, because by teaching it in an objective lens, he's teaching different worldviews and perspectives to the students, so that once they come out of middle school and they have their Christianity rooted in science background, they can look at other worldviews and perspectives and try to determine for themselves which one is right.
Thanks, Talia. Thanks so much. Yeah. So tonight, we're trying to broaden our horizons, wherever you're coming from tonight. We hope that this is a chance for you to ask questions that maybe you haven't asked at a church meeting, at least. Questions that maybe big questions you've pondered at night, those types of things. And in that spirit, after Dr. Hutchinson's talk this evening, we are going to have a time of open Q&A. And he's willing to, this is his specialty, just so you know, of helping people, interacting with people in the Q&A time. So I want to give you that time, and right now, as you're thinking about things, just give you time to prepare. As you think through his message, maybe take some mental notes or some actual notes and prepare for that. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Ian Hutchinson is a professor of nuclear science and engineering at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His primary research interest is in plasma physics, especially the magnetic confinement of plasmas, seeking to enable fusion reactions, the energy source of the stars, to be used for practical energy production. So the way I explain this to my kids is there's a movie called, well, never mind. So Back to the Future, where they put that little banana peels in the back of cars. I asked today how soon until we actually get one of those reactors that we can attach to the back of our car, and I was disappointingly heard never. But that gives you the idea of the type of thing that we would hope to achieve. Dr. Hutchinson teaches at one of the world's leading schools. He's one of the world's leading experts on plasma physics. He's designed a facility to magnetically contain plasmas that are more than 50 million degrees Celsius. I don't even know what that number means. And he believes in miracles. So he comes here tonight with a perspective that is perhaps not often heard. Maybe not unique, but not often heard. Someone deeply enrooted in faith and in science, and to help lead us in a discussion about can a scientist believe in miracles? So with that, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Hutchinson. And if you would, this is the good angle for the camera. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought that was a comfortable seat.
No, I want you to look good here. So before we get started today, I've got to know you a little bit, but I did want everyone to get a chance to know you a little bit in your background. You have been, well, I see that you're a professor of nuclear science and engineering at MIT. What's the backstory? What led you into that field? And if you could give us like a small picture of like what do you study and how did you get into that field?
Plasma physics is the physics of very hot gases. When gases get hotter than perhaps a few thousand degrees, the atoms are stripped of their electrons. They become separate, and that makes a plasma. The centers of stars, for example, are plasmas, and that's where fusion reactions, which are nuclear reactions between light elements that fuse together and make heavy elements, those are fusion reactions. That's where fusion reactions take place naturally. Fission reactions are the opposite. They take heavy elements like uranium and break them up, and that releases energy too. And that's the type of nuclear power we currently have on Earth. Is fission power. And fusion has some potential advantages relative to fission power as a ultimate source of energy. But in order to make fusion reactions work, you need these incredibly high temperatures, hundreds of millions of degrees Celsius. And so when something is that hot, you don't hold it in a plastic bottle because the bottle wouldn't last too long. Instead, you hold it using some force, some immaterial force. And the creators' fusion reactors are the stars, and they're held together by gravity. On Earth, we need something stronger because gravity needs something about the size of a star in order to be strong enough to hold it together. So bringing a star to Earth literally would not be what we want to do. So we use stronger forces, which are magnetic forces, stronger than gravity, and I, for 40 years now nearly, have been studying how we can do that.
So we have a reactor power in our area, Pottstown, just up the road. Yep. So how close are we to taking your technology and actually having one of those down the road so that we can power our
Well,
electric?
Fusion is a lot more difficult than fission. That's why it's taken us a lot longer to reach the point of being able to say whether or not we can make it practical. As it stands, we're in the midst, the world, 7 nations actually, are collaborating to build a fusion experiment. It's sited in the south of France, that if successful, it will generate 500 megawatts of fusion reactions for hundreds of seconds at a time. So 500 megawatts is sort of the size of a medium-sized electricity generating plant. That's only an experiment, though, because it's to figure out and to demonstrate, if we're successful, how we can do this from a scientific point of view. To go further than that, we'll need a lot of engineering to make it run round the clock, to take out the energy in a way that will generate electricity with it. So there'll be a lot of engineering that goes beyond that. So to make a long story short, people often ask me, when are we going to have fusion energy, fusion electricity on the grid, and I say, not in my lifetime.
Mm. So how does one become an MIT professor and get into this very specific field?
Well, how I became an MIT professor was that I discovered a love for and a talent in physics. This happened to me when I was in high school. I had originally thought I wanted to be a lawyer, but that was before I started to do science classes, and I just loved them. We had a fantastic teacher, and I was hooked. And so I set off to study science in high school, and I went to Cambridge University, and that was the start of it. Actually, when I was in school as a young boy, I wasn't a Christian. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. My family didn't go to church except possibly to weddings. And yet I wasn't ignorant of Christianity. The school I went to had some passing relationships with Worcester Cathedral in England. It had regular assemblies at which prayers were said and hymns were sung, and I enjoyed singing. But I didn't take Christianity particularly seriously. It wasn't that I was against it, it was just that I didn't really believe it, and it didn't seem to have any relevance to my life. But it wasn't until I was an undergraduate at Cambridge University that I began to take Christianity seriously. And the main reason I did that was that I had two very close college friends whose lives and whose intellect I admired, and they both turned out to be Christians. And in the second year of my undergraduate career in Cambridge, they invited me to go to a series of lectures given by Michael Green about the Christian faith and about the basis of it. And much to their surprise, I said yes. They thought I wouldn't go. And it was there that I think there were really two main new ideas that came across to me. At least these seemed totally new to me. I don't know whether I'd heard them before, but if I had, I hadn't been listening, okay, which is quite likely. And the two ideas were, first of all, that there's good evidence for the claims of Christianity, which I still believe. I think there's excellent historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And secondly, that the point of Christianity is to have a personal relationship to God through the saving power and grace of Jesus. And that idea of a personal relationship with God was, again, a new idea to me at the time that I took away from those lectures. And it was during the period of those lectures which I began to realize that actually I knew quite a lot about Christianity. I began to believe that, yeah, the evidence for it is pretty good. I kind of believe this stuff. But I also knew that if I were to go further, that I would have to take a step of faith, that I would have to reach the point of accepting Jesus' offer of salvation, and I would have to make him Lord of my life. And it was one evening during that period that I knelt in my room in college and I committed my life to Christ, and that was more than 40 years ago, and I've been a Christian ever since, and I've never regretted it.
So I noticed that you've written over 200 scientific journal articles, 2 advanced scientific textbooks. Some of the journal articles I can't even pronounce the titles of.
That's okay.
And but you've also written some popular books,
Yeah.
Monopolizing Knowledge, and then Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles? And you've obviously done enormous amounts of speaking in plasma physics, but you've also done a lot of speaking in what's called the Veritas Forum on college campuses and dialogues about faith and science. And what's kind of led you down that road to write on these types of books and speak?
Well, I think for me, the relationship between science and Christianity, while it's had its tensions in my own life, has never been a big problem. And I think maybe partly that's because both my science and my Christian faith grew up together. When I became a Christian when I was an undergraduate, I was studying physics, and I began to study my Christian faith. I had the benefit of college groups, Bible studies and things like that, which were a tremendous help to me and fellowship to me. And so in a certain sense, those two strands of my intellectual life, spiritual as well as intellectual life, grew up together. And so I spent quite a lot of time thinking through how one understands the relationship between science and the Christian faith. And actually, I decided early on in my Christian career that I wanted to speak for Christ. And I took some training to be a Methodist local preacher, and I was speaking about the faith, and I was, developing my science. And as these two things grew together, I began to give talks about the relationship between science and faith. And one thing led to another, some momentum grew, other people invited me to give talks to their fellowship about this, and so I gradually began to give these kinds of talks. And so it's become a very natural, a slowly growing process for me, but I think that I have some insights to share, or at least other people have said so, and so that's why I do it.
So, did you notice he said he was trained as a Methodist minister first? I considered becoming an MIT professor first, but decided no, I'm going to go into ministry instead. What you guys don't necessarily know, we met in Cambridge and got to spend some really just wonderful days together in England, and then today came over to my house for lunch and ended up like rewiring my house for me.
Small detail.
So it's just
it's all
really
part of the service.
Fantastic, and all that. So it's not just because you rewired my house, but it is great to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm really excited tonight to share this experience with all of you. And I do hope that you won't hold back on Q&A, because that's the best. All right? So with that, thank you so much, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks. Okay, it's my job now to escape from all of this and bring up my own slides. Here they are. Thank you for the chance to speak to you and be with you. Can a scientist believe in miracles? As has already been mentioned, when speaking to audiences about science and religion, I think the questions are often the most interesting part. And actually, I'm going to leave plenty of time. I'm not going to speak for terribly long because I think that we want to get to the questions, and I'm going to do that as soon as we reasonably can. So the book that Paul just mentioned, entitled "Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles?" The title of that book is really just one of hundreds of questions that I've been asked over the years in speaking on this topic of science and faith. Those of you who are interested, the contents of my book shows that actually those questions cover a vast range of topics. So the question in the title is just one of many questions. But it is in many ways the most, or certainly one of the most important questions about the relationship between science and the Christian faith. And there's a sense in which, of course, it's a silly question. I mean, obviously, I'm a scientist, I believe in miracles, so scientists can believe in miracles. That settles the question. Well, no, we're not going to go home right away. You should hesitate a little bit because we need to go dig a little bit deeper, because I mean, perhaps I'm lying, or perhaps I'm self-deceived about my beliefs, either about the fact that I'm a scientist or that I believe in Christians, that I believe in miracles. So you shouldn't probably just take my word for it. I mean, after all, there are many, many people in this world who think that science is simply impossible if you take seriously such things as miracles, and who think that miracles are simply impossible if you take seriously such things as modern science. An example of one of those people is Alan Lightman, who's a colleague of mine at MIT, and he recently wrote an article that appeared in Salon online magazine, and in it he calls the central doctrine of science the view that the laws of nature are inviolable. He says, quote, "Science and God are compatible as long as the latter, God, is content to stand on the sidelines once the universe has begun." In other words, he thinks it is a requirement for science that the laws of the universe are complete, closed, and impervious to outside action. And on this view, his central doctrine of science, which presumably is essential for science to function, immediately rules out God acting in the world. The only form of God that could survive such a restriction is one that simply happened to have set the universe going, but thereafter is powerless to change anything within it and pretty much irrelevant to anything going on in it. And such a deistic, non-interventionist first cause might possibly be more powerless than Bill Belichick is on the sidelines of the Patriots. At any rate, that God would not be the God of the Bible, of Judaism, or of Christianity. Now, I'm a Christian. Christians believe that Jesus, the Son of God, died on the cross for our sins and rose again miraculously on the third day. Every Christian worthy of the name believes in at least that miracle. So how do I answer Alan Lightman? Well, it's pretty straightforward. The presumption that the laws of nature are inviolable is just not a doctrine of science. Alan and a lot of other people are simply wrong about that. It's true that science's method and program is to describe the universe insofar as it is describable in terms that are reproducible and following universal laws. But science hasn't the slightest need to extrapolate that method and program into a presumption that everything that happens must be so describable. I'm not going to unpack in detail what makes natural science what it is, but most people realize that there are certain characteristics and strategies that science adopts in order to obtain its knowledge and that are the basis of science. And I identify these strategies as a reliance upon reproducibility, that different people can get the same results from repeated experiments or observations, and an insistence upon a descriptive clarity so that the results of an experiment, even if not its interpretation, are expressed in ways that are unambiguous and that scientists can agree upon and understand. But the crucial point is that this approach cannot be applied to every question of interest or to all different types of knowledge. Now, the opposite presumption is called scientism, and it has taken root throughout our society and very deeply in universities over the past 100 years or so. It's the view that the methods of natural science are the only route to knowledge. And that presumption is what we call scientism, whose short definition is that it is the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. To give you an example, in 1935, the famous philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote in his book, Religion and Science, quote, "Whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know," end quote. Well, this is pure nonsense. If you mean by science things like physics and chemistry and biology and geology and cosmology and so forth, that is what most people mean by science, especially when they're thinking about science and religion. And that is what I mean by science in our discussion today. So, by contrast, consider history, for example. History contains enormous amounts of true knowledge about the past and about the events of the past of great importance. But hardly any of that knowledge is acquired by the methods of science, relying on reproducible experiments and observations. And the reason is because most events of human history are unique and unreproducible, and hardly any of the knowledge in history is expressible with the kind of scientific clarity of measurement and classification and mathematics and so forth that we attribute to it. So there are some examples of people like Russell that I just quoted who are explicit about their scientism, but scientism is more usually implicit. That is, it's unacknowledged. People don't generally declare an allegiance to scientism. More often, they simply presume it. And implicit scientism is very obvious in the writings of the anti-theists of this century. For example, Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, writes the following, quote, "Did Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? Did he himself come alive again 3 days after being crucified? There is an answer to every such question, whether or not we can discover it in practice. And it is strictly a scientific answer. The methods we should use to settle the matter would be purely and entirely scientific methods." End quote. Look, the resurrection is not a scientific claim, it's an historical claim. So the methods that should be used to investigate it are not scientific, they're historical. Only the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is could lead one to suppose that, quote, "purely and entirely scientific methods are what is required." Probably then, I would say, the most important way to make progress in understanding the relationship between science and religious faith is to realize that scientism is a ghastly mistake, and that religious knowledge, like knowledge in many other disciplines, is not scientific. Those other disciplines include things like jurisprudence, aesthetics, language, literature, philosophy itself. None of those are scientific topics. So, to return to the question of whether the laws of science are inviolable, the majority of the great scientists of history did not make the scientistic presumption. They did not think that the laws of science were complete and inviolable. How can we know that they didn't? Because a large fraction of them were convinced Christians. Many of the greatest scientists of history, like Newton, Boyle, Dalton, Faraday, Maxwell, and many others, were Christian believers who saw their science as consistent with a God who is active in the world and on occasion performs miracles beyond the scientific laws they were discovering. So the notion that for science to function, or in order to be a successful scientist, it's necessary to believe in inviolable universal laws is, in my view, indisputably disproved by history. It's just not true. And you needn't take the word of me or of any other high-profile Christian scientists of today. If scientists couldn't believe in miracles, then most of the great scientists of history weren't scientists. But of course they were. Now, the skeptics' common answer to what I consider this indisputable argument might question either the scientists' science or their faith. So one response is to say, well, the scientists of history didn't know the science that we know today. Well, that's true, and I'm going to come back to that. But the second point, or the second skeptical answer, is to say, well, probably those people that I've just cited mostly just went along with the customs of the society of their day. Probably Christian belief was just an incidental part of their background mental baggage, which today we know must be dispensed with. But that second comment is definitely not true. We know from written evidence that it was untrue for all of the people that I cited. They weren't just nominal religious believers. They spent enormous efforts to understand and follow their faith. And this, by the way, is the front page of a book written by Robert Boyle of Boyle's Law. And it's entitled The Christian Virtuoso, that claims to show that by being addicted to experimental philosophy, a man is rather assisted than indisposed to be a good Christian. They confused their F's and their S's in those days, you may notice. But let's not get bogged down. The more interesting question is not can a scientist believe in miracles, but should scientists believe in miracles? In other words, we should grant that in fact scientists have and do and can believe in miracles, but we should move on to the question of whether they're right to do so. Here again, I think an understanding of the history of science can help us. The history, in this case, not so much of the individuals that I've mentioned, but of ideas. In the latter part of the 19th century, classical physics was reaching, in a certain sense, the pinnacle of its achievement. Maxwell's equations had unified electricity and magnetism and light, and the laws of physics were appearing more and more to be complete and closed. Even biology seemed to be susceptible to being described by science through Darwin's mechanism of natural selection. And increasingly, to many people, it seemed as if the whole of the universe obeyed deterministic classical equations, so that if you knew the initial conditions, you could solve the equations, and the future was completely determined by those equations. And a belief in that deterministic philosophy was one of the important factors cited by those in the 19th century who rejected Christianity. But since then, the discovery of quantum mechanics has greatly increased our understanding and of the natural universe, and the understanding of nonlinear phenomena, for example, chaos. To get those two things together have essentially overthrown the deterministic outlook in physics. Not only do we now know that the solutions of the classical equations are sometimes indeterminable because of exquisite sensitivity to initial conditions, but also quantum physics has shown that there are fundamental aspects of the universe that are simply not determined by classical equations. The deterministic laws cannot completely describe. An example is the decay of a particular radioactive nucleus. We know how to describe that probabilistically, but if you ask the question, when will this particular nucleus decay, you cannot predict when that will happen. You can only say it has a certain probability of happening over a certain time. And because you can take radioactive decay and cause it to trigger some kind of macroscopic event, like the breaking of a jar of cyanide poison and the subsequent poisoning of a cat, that means that even macroscopic events have an inherent indeterminacy in this universe. We now know this from science. So one might say that science has labored mightily for hundreds of years to understand the world using deterministic descriptions, only to find that the universe resists being completely described in those terms. It might have seemed a good argument in the 19th century to say that the laws of physics showed that God could not act in the world, and that the universe was governed by closed, inviolable physical laws. So how could there be such a thing as a miracle? But today, that argument is naive and untrue, even as far as our scientific understanding is concerned, because nature is far more mysterious than the Victorians thought. So, if I come back to the point about the scientists of history not knowing what we know today, that's true. But actually, what we know of physics today has, if anything, undermined the skeptical position. The argument that the universe is a closed system of scientific laws is substantially less plausible on today's science than it was, for example, in the 19th century. All right. Well, suppose now, then, that science doesn't actually rule out the theoretical possibility of a miracle. And that's certainly my view, and I think the view of many people. Still, one might ask, if miracles happen, why aren't there by now lots of scientifically proven, demonstrated miracles that would persuade everyone of their reality? And I want to start thinking about this question, which I think is a very important question, with a true personal story. About 35 years ago, my daughter Anna, this is her 35 years ago, this is her a couple of years ago with her family, for no good reason than I love her. So back to this one, okay. She had a playmate who belonged to a Christian family in our street. We were living in England at the time. And the playmate contracted meningitis, and the girl fell into a coma, and in hospital, the doctors gave a very bad prognosis that even if she did recover consciousness, she would likely have brain damage and perhaps be seriously handicapped. Well, the elders of the church came together with the parents of this girl, and they came to the bedside. These were Christian people, and they prayed in faith for her healing. And within days, she was awake with apparently no ill effects, and within a week or so, she was back in the street playing with my daughter. Now, what should we say? Was that or was that not a miracle? How does natural science work? It works on the basis of reproducible experiments or observations. If I do an experiment here and now, science assumes that someone else can repeat it and get the same answer. That's absolutely fundamental to the way science works. It's what makes science what it is. But how do you apply that characteristic method to a miracle? For example, the miracle that I just suggested to you. A miracle is by definition something unique, never to be reproduced. It's intrinsic to the whole idea of a miracle that it is unreproducible. Consequently, natural science is inherently incompetent to prove something is a miracle. And by the way, there are lots of other important aspects of life that are also beyond the reach of science. So this understanding is the answer to why the world is not full of scientifically demonstrated miracles. Science is inherently incompetent to demonstrate a miracle. Science can investigate miraculous claims. It may be able to reveal deception or trickery or misperception. But if it doesn't discover such confounding factors, then it is not in a position to pronounce one way or the other about the miracle. And this was true of the story that I just told you. The girl's parents consider the events of her recovery as the experience of a miraculous healing, as a proof and confirmation of God's love and care towards them and of the reality and relevance of their faith in Christ. But what would a physician say about the situation? Well, he or she might say that there was no scientific explanation, but there are a lot of things about medicine that we don't understand. He might say that he had or had not ever seen a case like this. But what I suggest he or she should not say is that a lack of explanation of this event on scientific ground proves scientifically that a miracle has occurred. I think a scientist, qua scientist, is obliged to leave that undecided. And part of the reason for that is that perceiving a miracle depends upon the interpretation of the event. A miracle isn't just an anomalous event that seems contrary to science. There are, after all, a lot of anomalous events that seem contrary to science happening every day. Actually, many of them happen in scientific laboratories. They're called mistakes. But when they're not reproducible, when we do the measurement again, it makes sense then in the way that it didn't before. We just set it aside and we move on in order to understand the reproducible behavior of the world. And that's the way that science works. So the interpretation of an extraordinary event depends on the context and on your presuppositions. And that's one reason, I think, that Jesus often emphasized the importance of faith. If you're closed to the possibility of a miracle, then you are never going to be convinced. Now, don't get me wrong here. I see that English girl's healing as an act of God in answer to prayer, and in that sense at least, miraculous. So as far as I am concerned, that was a miracle. But my view is that there's no way to prove scientifically that that was a miracle, because science can't do that kind of proof. And it's unreasonable to demand that kind of proof of science. It's worth just pausing for a moment to think about how the Bible refers to miracles. The Bible, of course, doesn't use the word miracle because it wasn't written in English. In the New Testament, the miracles of Jesus are referred to by three Greek words that could be translated signs, or wonders, or mighty works. And two common features of those events that we see as being miraculous in the New Testaments, in the Gospels particularly, are that they are extraordinary and that they are acts of God. And so I think the simplest, straightforward definition of what a miracle is in the sense of the New Testament is therefore an extraordinary act of God. Now, while we're at it, I want to comment on a distinction that is often drawn between two types of miracles. These two types can be thought of as being, on the one hand, events that break a law of nature, and on the other, merely extraordinary confluence of circumstances, coincidences, if you like. And so to illustrate what I mean, one might consider the example of a type of miracle that would be considered to be breaking a natural law as being the turning of water into wine. An example of a miracle that might be considered to be a confluence of circumstances might be Jesus' prediction that the night before the crucifixion, Peter would deny him 3 times. I mean, the second might just have been a lucky guess. The first, turning water into wine, seems to me to have no explanation, or I'm very hard-pressed to think of an explanation that could be consistent with the normal course of events. Now, most people recognize that the confluence of circumstances type of miracle, this type of miracle, is not something that is ruled out by the laws of nature. But what I hope you've begun to get the flavor for is that I'm arguing that not only is this type of miracle not ruled out by the laws of nature, but also this isn't ruled out by the laws of nature. In other words, the laws of nature describe the normal working of the world, but miracles are inherently abnormal. They aren't constrained by the normal rules. And actually, also, I want you to get the feeling that both types of miracle require some interpretation to be recognized. The difference between them, which may seem stark to you, is in fact a modern difference that is far less clear than one might think. So if you were to think of another biblical miracle, for example, Jesus stilling the storm when they were on the boat on the Sea of Galilee, was that an example of a law breaking, or was it an example of a confluence of circumstances? Well, it could be either, or could be both. And to me, therefore, it's a mistake to define a miracle as being something that breaks a law of nature, a violation of the law of nature. There's no way to prove that violation scientifically, but it doesn't mean that we can never be persuaded by events that God is at work. It means, though, we are never relieved of the necessity for interpretation. There's never some totally self-authenticating demonstration that cannot be gainsaid by a skeptic. Something may be entirely persuasive to me that isn't persuasive to someone else. So the view I take then of this situation is that the reason, in part, I'm going to skip this because time is pressing, that miracle interpretation requires that perceiving miracles require interpretation is that to understand something as a miracle, you need to see it as an act of God. Well, an act of God is an act of an agent. And science is not in the business of detecting or explaining things in terms of agency. It's in the business of explaining things in terms of the mechanisms of our universe, in terms of causes that are efficient as opposed to the causes that might come from agency. And therefore, it's important to recognize that the Bible sees God at work in all aspects of nature, whether they are understood or whether they are not understood. And the best example I can give of this in the context of miracles is the founding event of the Hebrew faith, namely the Exodus. Now, probably there are plenty of people who saw the movie The Ten Commandments when it first came out in the audience, but there are probably lots more of you who might have seen it on TV reruns. But if you are familiar with this wonderful movie, Charlton Heston as Moses, you recognize this is actually a painting that's sort of part of the inspiration of that movie, of the people crossing the Red Sea, the people of Israel crossing the Red Sea. And that movie, wonderful movie though it is, and its special effects were great for the day. Of course, they're kind of ho-hum for today, but things move on. But I think that tends to distract a little bit from what the Bible actually says about things. So I want to draw your attention to what the Bible actually says about the crossing of the Red Sea. Exodus 14:21 says, "Then Moses, where is he there? Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided." So what is this saying? It's saying that, in fact, there was a natural, in a crude sense, a scientific explanation of the events to which the passage refers. And that explanation was the persistent east wind. So the fact that there was a persistent east wind that explained why the waters were divided doesn't prevent the writer from seeing God at work. In other words, what's happening here is that different levels of explanation are simultaneously being considered to be valid. Yes, there was a persistent east wind, and that was the cause of the waters being divided. But God was in control. God was acting through those natural processes and bringing his will to pass. And so it's perfectly sensible for this to be interpreted as a miracle, even if there was a perfectly natural, in a certain sense, scientific explanation of it. So it is, I would argue that it has always been a characteristic of biblical faith to see God not just in some supposed gaps of scientific knowledge, but in all the events of life, whether they have a natural explanation or not. And to emphasize that a personal God must be sought in higher levels of descriptions, which are valid simultaneously with any other more naturalistic or scientific ones. And that's not just a defensive reaction to the progress of science. It's what has always been the case in religious experience. Skeptics sometimes say things like this, that in olden times people didn't understand the workings of the natural world, and so everything seemed miraculous. Whereas now we understand so much more, we're better informed, so we can't believe in miracles. I want to say that this view is really a misrepresentation. It's untrue to history and to logic. I mean, concerning history, of course people in New Testament times knew much less science than scientists know today. But that doesn't mean they knew nothing about the normal course of events and thought everything was miraculous. That's, of course, nonsense. They knew perfectly well in the first century that people blind from birth don't suddenly regain their sight when they're adults. The water doesn't turn suddenly into wine, or that people who are crucified don't suddenly rise from the dead. In fact, if they didn't know that those events don't happen, they wouldn't have been considered extraordinary demonstrations of God's power and action in the world. Those events functioned logically for the first century as signs of God's power, only because they knew that they were humanly impossible. So what I'm trying to get at is this question of superstition. It's certainly true that superstitions have abounded in history. Perhaps we're less superstitious today, but I'm actually not so sure about that. If you think about the superstitions that surround various sports teams, people crossing their fingers and all the things they do to make sure that their team is going to win, we're still pretty superstitious lot today, I think. I'm just as skeptical as the next person about the proliferation of popular myths about people, figures of history or figures of today for that matter. And I do think that it's true that people naturally have a hankering after the mysterious and the exciting, and that often causes them to be led into superstition. But the fact that some miracle stories are just superstition, implausible, doesn't prove that all miracles are superstitions. Miracle stories are not all equal. The evidence for or against a miracle claim being true, needs to be weighed. It's illogical to rule out miracles simply because they're miraculous, unless you already know that there's no such thing as a miracle. But science does not provide you with that knowledge. So if you adopt the opinion that miracles just never happen, then I would say you're doing so not as a matter of physics, but as a matter of metaphysics. Or to put it more simply, that if you adopt the view that miracles never happen, you are doing so as a matter of faith. Now, I'm going to leave up an outline of some of the topics that I've covered that might help remind us as we go through and we're entering the question time. So let me close very quickly by just saying this. In the end, miracles are possible if there is a living God who is in touch with the world. We Christians say we have personal experience of that living God through the Holy Spirit, the counselor, who dwells in us, bringing comfort and understanding and remembrance and conviction. And while we don't call that daily relationship with God a miracle because it's not extraordinary, it's nevertheless an important reason why a Christian, whether or not he's a scientist, can believe in miracles. Thank you very much.
So at this point, we're going to turn to Q&A, and I'll be in front with the mic, and Mike will be in back with the mic. So if you have a question, just raise your hand or wave us down, and we'll come to you. I wanted to start out, thank you, Dr. Hutchinson, start out with a couple of questions that we have, get people thinking. These are from this morning. The first one is this. As a scientist, what are the proofs, or what proofs make you believe in God?
What proofs, as a scientist, make me
Yes.
believe in God? Well, as I've said before, I think that the reasons for belief in God, if you like, the proofs of God, are largely not scientific, and I won't specify all of them right now. Certainly the reasons I believe in God are largely not scientific. There are the things that I think are strongest in persuading me of the intellectual coherence of my faith are a combination of historical evidence and personal religious experience. But there are some ways in which science does point us to God, And there are some very constructive ways in which science and particularly the Christian faith have interacted over history. So one example one could point to is that actually the very existence of science was in large measure encouraged by, and some would say was birthed in, a kind of theological and philosophical matrix that was provided by Christianity. It's notable that science, modern science as we knew it, grew up largely in the West where Christianity held sway. The anti-theists often say that religion held back science for centuries. Actually, I think a more rational view is that, and one that's held largely by historians of science today, is that if anything, it's the opposite. Actually, that science was awaiting a kind of theological and philosophical ground in which it could grow. And it was in large measure the understanding of the creation that's given to us by the Bible, which served as that fruitful and pleasant environment in which science could grow. So I think there are many constructive relationships between science and Christianity. I've mentioned scientists too. But I don't look to science for proofs of my faith. I think there are things in science which lead me to think deeply and say, isn't that interesting? That situation in science, for example, is easily understood if we take the view that there is a creator God. It's less easily understood in other ways. But I prefer not to offer scientific proofs of God. Thank you.
Helpful. One more, and this will be, I'm just going to read it. I'm not to blame. How do you deal with scientifically impossible miracles in the Bible? For example, the sun stopping in the sky.
Yeah, there are lots of events that are described in the Bible which it's very hard to see how there could be any kind of explanation other than that the world, the universe, worked differently for a time than it normally does, and that's the sun stopping in the sky is one of them. One can imagine that that the Bible, for example, in that situation, was referring to the perception of the people at that time. And that perception might simply mean that what's being stated is a very poetic statement, that it just seemed like the sun was standing still and we were fighting this battle and it just went on and on and on. Or there could be other phenomena. But I actually don't really think those types of explanations are terribly important. Those could be correct explanations of what the Bible is meaning. But I actually also don't think that it's impossible that God could have arranged it that, the sun did stand still somehow. I think it would be surprising to me if that were the case, but I think that there are lots of surprising things that happen. So I think if you interpret that particular miracle as being that the sun literally stood still in the sky, actually, what you have to do is you have to begin to say, well, now wait. The sun's stopping still in the sky. That doesn't mean anything happened to the sun. What it means is that something must have happened to the earth. Okay? We're already going down a path that is applying to the scriptures an approach which I don't think is terribly helpful. I do believe that miracles happen, and I think that water did change into wine. I have no scientific explanation of how that could have happened, or this miracle.
Do you view the Big Bang as a miracle?
Well, I mean, perhaps according to my definition, it was an extraordinary act of God. So perhaps in that sense, it was a miracle. But I do think that we have very extensive scientific understanding of how the universe began these days. So cosmology has been able to give plausible explanations in terms of the laws of physics of how the universe evolved from very early times, maybe of order a second, to where it is today, 13.7 billion years later, after it's been expanding all of that time. So we have very good scientific evidence, for example, for the age of the universe, for the fact that it's been expanding all that time, for the evolution of matter through various stages, one of which, for example, is the recombination event, which is what gave rise to the microwave background radiation, which is a very important diagnostic of how uniform the early universe was. So I would say we have an increasingly satisfactory explanation of large parts of the evolution of the Big Bang once it existed. There are theories and speculations about what happened at earlier times, about how the Big Bang got going in the first place. And I don't know whether those speculations are going to prove out to be scientifically sound. And nor does anybody else, for that matter. I mean, some people are, there's room for having an opinion about how speculative these theories are. But even if we discover that there is, in a certain sense, a more or less complete explanation of how the universe got going through the laws of physics, so that in that sense, the Big Bang is not a violation of the laws of physics, and it may not be, that doesn't rule out God's action. In fact, the question that it then poses is, where did the laws of physics come from? And of course, our answer is the laws of physics came from God. Those of us who are Christian believers should take that view, I think. So, thank you for that question. It's kind of, I've kind of gone both ways on it, but that's about how I feel about it.
I mean, traditionally we hear that scientists are very stubborn about talking about the supernatural or the unprovable things. I mean, from your experiences, what role in academic conversation do miracles come up or get involved when you're talking with your peers?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that scientists are hard-boiled. I think I'm pretty hard-boiled. When it comes to science, my students would probably tell you that. I don't suffer gladly, woolly thinking or speculation. And that is part of the scientific discipline of understanding clearly what one is saying and understanding what the reasons are for believing it. I've tried to say in what I've said already that I don't think that scientifically you can prove that that a miracle occurs in a particular situation. And in that sense, a scientist, from the point of view of science, has to be, I would say, cautious, if not silent, about the question of whether something's a miracle or not. And so in that sense, it doesn't surprise me that I'm not forever talking about miracles with my colleagues at MIT. We talk about science is what we talk about. I don't think that reticence or that caution necessarily implies that for a scientist to believe in miracles today or in history is unusual. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. But there are people, and I partly gave the Alan Lightman as an example, but there are certainly scientists who insist that the laws of nature are inviolable and must be inviolable. The thing I wanted to try to point, and therefore that there can't be things that they would call miracles, because those people typically take the view that a miracle is a violation of natural law. But I think that's more of a kind of particular philosophical argument, which isn't something proven by science. Thank you for that question.
I was wondering what the purpose God may have for miracles when it seems that both Old Testament and New Testament examples, he performed many miracles through the hands of Moses and through Jesus, and they still didn't believe. Jesus told Thomas when he said he believed after he saw him that you believe because you've seen. Blessed are those who believe who they haven't seen. So faith is actually something that we trust God about. You know, the people say, I'll believe it when I see it. And the truth is you'll see it when you believe it.
Well, I think there's great truth in that, and I sort of alluded to that in the fact that Jesus himself emphasized the importance of faith in all contexts of miracles. And he was particularly reticent when people came to him and were asking for him to give them a sign to prove that he was who he was. And I think, and I wanted to suggest in my talk that he did that because he knew what you just said, which is that in the end it doesn't matter what you show people, they're going to believe what they're open to believing. And if they're not open to believing in a God who acts in the world, then they're going to continue along their own path. So I think I take your comment as very much the way I think about things. And again, I mentioned it in terms of interpretation. When we see these extraordinary events, do we see the hand of God or not? Some people do, and some people act accordingly. And so for many people in the New Testament, or the Old for that matter, people saw these extraordinary acts of God and it brought them to repentance and it changed their lives. But others, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, etc., just went on saying, yeah, I'm not doing that. Thank you.
Hi. With the discussion nowadays about quantum physics and the embracing of the idea of the multiverse or the multiple universes based on something happens, and then if it hadn't happened, there's a universe that goes in that direction versus this versus that. And then having scientists nowadays like Brian Greene and like Neil deGrasse Tyson who are speaking about this multi-universe construction as fact, as scientific, almost scientifically proven, without the idea of the scientific method to do such proofs. Do you see that that's kind of incongruous to the same talk about everything must be scientifically proven?
I get it. Thank you for that question. Yeah, multiverse is an interesting question. In science, there are things that are considered to be known because the evidence has built up over years. They've been tried and tested, and we can very often consider them to be established laws. Newton's law of motion, for example, Maxwell's equations, these kinds of things. These have been around so long, they're never going to be overthrown. And even though you might say Newton's laws were overthrown by Einstein's relativity, they weren't overthrown. They were actually modified slightly. But there are other things which are very speculative, and it's perfectly okay for scientists to have speculative theories and to try to test them and see if they're true. And the multiverse is a perfectly reasonable theory that comes out of a very speculative idea of how inflation might cause the universe to be very uniform, which is that it is observed to be. But the multiverse is an incredibly speculative, unproven idea. If anyone speaks as if this is proven by science, they are misrepresenting the science. I don't know how clearly people like Neil deGrasse Tyson have done so. I wouldn't care to document it. But certainly I think it's very important for science to speak clearly about what things are known with great confidence and what things are almost entirely speculative. On the topic of the multiverse, however, I would say the multiverse doesn't have a very big impact on Christian theology. If it turns out that there really is a multiverse and we're just in one universe out of many, I'm not persuaded that this has a big impact on Christian theology. It doesn't disprove any of the ideas we might have about God. It doesn't prove that God didn't create the multiverse, that it mightn't have been part of his plan. And so I am comfortable with the idea that the multiverse is an idea out there, that I am not obliged by my Christian faith to either believe or disbelieve. I can hold it in its speculative mode, and it says it's not going to make a big deal to me one way or the other. Because in the end, we believe our God is the creator of everything, and that includes the laws of physics. And so, however those things work out, I think our faith will be sure in those types of situations. But thank you for raising that. I know that there are many particularly popularizers of science who draw inappropriate philosophical and theological conclusions from shaky interpretations of science. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Hutchinson, for being here.
It's a pleasure.
I had a question, and it kind of tied into your idea that faith is needed to perceive a miracle. You're kind of leaning on that as a positive, so saying, well, if you have faith, you can see something as a miracle. Can you also see that as a negative, where faith would allow you to give something an explanation that really doesn't have one? So, for instance, in the situation that you had brought up with your daughter's childhood friend who was cured, which is wonderful that she was, you're applying it as seeing it as due to a personal faith, that it is reasonable to see for you that there was an intervention from God that provided healing, as opposed to someone who doesn't come from a background of faith, seeing it as it's great that it happened, but we just don't understand where that came from. So it kind of falls into, well, since we don't understand, because I could put the element of faith into it, well, that leads me to just believe that, okay, well, then it has God as an explanation. So if you don't have faith, then it would just be, well, I just don't see it because I just don't understand it. I could also see that with faith, making something that seems very illogical. So, for instance, the virgin birth. Because of your presupposition of faith, that seems maybe like, I don't want to say the word reasonable, but something that you would believe occurred because of your faith. But if you're coming with a presupposition of just looking at the evidence of how birth has happened throughout, the rest of human civilization, what's more likely? What's more likely that Jesus was miraculously born to a virgin, or that a Jewish girl told a lie?
Thank you for that question. It's certainly the case that the interpretation of miracles depends on your presuppositions. And these presuppositions tend largely to be things that are not proven one way or the other, and therefore we sometimes refer to them as faith, okay? And I've pointed out that if you take the view that miracles don't happen, that's just as much taking a faith position as it is taking the view that miracles can happen because there is a God, because in both cases they're metaphysical presuppositions. And so I think it's inescapable that the way we interpret miracles is going to be influenced by our presuppositions. Now, if it comes to particular miracles and deciding the truth of a particular miracle, okay, when you're trying to decide whether this particular miracle claim is actually truly a miracle or whether it's just a claim, what you're trying to balance is, the probability that, let's say, the witness or the claimant or whoever it is wrong or lying or pretending or whatever, and you're trying to balance that probability against the probability that a miracle could have happened, okay? The difficulty we have isn't so much how to estimate how probable it is that people lie, okay, or are deceived. We have got a lot of practice with that, okay, and we know how to do that. The difficulty is figuring out what the probability is that a miracle might have happened, and that is almost entirely determined by your presuppositions. It can also be influenced, though, by what you consider to be past history. And so David Hume, who's a famous philosopher who talked about miracles and didn't believe in them and argued that he had a proof that they didn't happen, put it this way, that if we have an unalterable experience that the world works in a certain way, then the likelihood of some miracle occurring is negligibly small. I mean, this is the gist of his argument. It would be reasonable for us to adopt that view if miracle claims were so rare as to justify the view that Hume put forward, that there is unalterable human experience against them. But it's actually not true that there are no miracle claims. There are actually lots of miracle claims in the world. In fact, Craig Keener, who's documented a whole set of miracle claims, he's a New Testament scholar actually, but so he's used to gathering together documentary evidence, okay? And he's done this for a lot of miracles. And he wrote a book a few years ago just called Miracles, in which he documents lots of modern miracle claims. So it simply isn't the case that nobody ever claims a miracle. Lots of people claim there to be a miracle. So the difficulty we're up against is there isn't an empirical way of deciding this question. So my answer to your question is, yes, you're quite right. It depends on metaphysics. But I would also say that there are some ways in which the plausibility of different metaphysical presuppositions can be addressed, but that the evidence to prove them needs to be weighed. Sorry, that's about as much as I can tell you on that one. There are some questions over here. Where's the mic? Someone's got a mic. Oh, we've got a question right at the back.
First off, thank you so much for coming out. So on the historical side of miracles, I'm pretty familiar with the scientific and discussing that matter, but on the historical context, we've often jumped from atheist, of like the naturalistic science of there are none, to the Christian. So what are we doing with all the theist in between? So obviously there's anything from Muslim, Judaism, Native American to, tribal of Africa, that miracles are occurring. So what's kind of your thought process of not simply Christian miracles, but miracles of any faith?
Yeah, one of the topics that surrounds this question of miracles is, well, what about miracles in other religions? And actually, David Hume, whom I was just speaking about, had something to say about this. He said that he thought that miracles in other religions disprove Christian miracles, because in a certain sense, he thought Christians all ought to take the view that all miracle claims in other religions are false, and therefore that, in a certain sense, weights the evidence against miracle claims. I actually don't think he was right. I don't think we necessarily, as Christians, have to suppose that all miracle claims in other religions are false. But I do think that the topic is worth thinking about. I actually disagree with the fact. I think that simply the way you do the probabilistic calculation, which I won't impose upon you this evening. It would probably be too hard to explain it to me, to an audience or even to scientists in the time available. But the probabilistic argument is actually a rather bad argument. It isn't the case that if we have a set of miracle claims that we decide all must be false, for example, miracle claims in other religions, it isn't the case that reduces the plausibility of Christian miracles. I mean, after all, if you draw a hard and fast distinction between religions in the way that, for example, Hume was wanting us to, then really the plausibility of miracle claims in other religions doesn't say terribly much about the plausibility of miracles in Christianity. I think there was a sort of another question kind of at the back of what you said, but I don't know whether I quite addressed what you were saying. I think perhaps you were also asking a little bit about whether miracles happened predominantly, for example, in the New Testament times and don't take place so strongly today. Maybe I'll leave that as a question in the background, and we should literally ask someone else their questions, right?
Well,
how are we doing for time?
For the interest of time, we're going to have to wrap it up, but we will be around for a few minutes if you want to come up and ask some questions. Also, I wanted to say, if you have questions, there are 220 questions answered in this, such as, is God's existence a scientific question? And aren't you a Christian just because of culture? And what's the difference between science and scientism? And is there a warfare between science and theology, et cetera, et cetera? Dr. Hutchinson will be out back signing books if you'd like. And also want to invite you next Sunday. We'll be wrapping up our Faith in Science series with a philosophy professor from Indiana University, Dr. Tim O'Connor. He'll be discussing the neurobiology of free will. When you look at science and neuroscience, the latest neuroscientific discoveries, and the concept of human free will, how do we make sense of those things? Yeah. So let's give a warm thank you to Dr. Hutchinson.